Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Marshall Eldridge had built his life with the same precision he applied to everything else, methodically, intelligently, and with unwavering determination. At 42, he owned a thriving cybersecurity consulting firm in Denver, drove a Mercedes he'd paid for in cash, and lived in a house with mountain views that made visitors gasp. He was 6'2", kept himself in shape with early morning runs, and had the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing he'd earned everything he had. His wife, Tiffany, had been the final piece of his perfect puzzle. They'd met 4 years ago at a charity fundraiser where she'd volunteered as an event coordinator. She was 35, beautiful in an understated way, with honey blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to sparkle with genuine warmth. She'd told him about her difficult first marriage, how she'd rebuilt herself after a devastating divorce, and Marshall had admired her resilience. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in Aspen. But perfection, Marshall would learn, was often an illusion. The stomach pains had started 3 months ago, sharp, persistent, enough to wake him at night. Tiffany had insisted he see her doctor, Brian Bates, a gastroenterologist she'd known from her previous life in Chicago. "He's the best," she'd assured him, touching his arm with what seemed like genuine concern. "He helped me through some digestive issues years ago. I trust him completely." Dr. Bates had been professional during the consultation, perhaps a touch too friendly with Tiffany when she'd accompanied Marshall to the appointment. He'd recommended an endoscopy, standard procedure, nothing to worry about. Marshall had agreed, despite a nagging instinct that whispered something wasn't quite right. That instinct had kept him alive in the cutthroat world of corporate security. He'd learned to trust it. The procedure was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Peak Medical Center. Tiffany had driven him, held his hand in the waiting room, kissed his forehead before they wheeled him back. "I'll be right here when you wake up," she'd promised, her eyes glistening with what looked like tears. The anesthesia had pulled him under quickly, or so they thought. Marshall had always had an unusual reaction to sedatives. In college, he'd woken up during a wisdom tooth extraction, unable to move or speak, but fully conscious. The dentist had never noticed. He'd learned then that his body metabolized anesthesia differently than most people. He'd mentioned it to the anesthesiologist, but the man had dismissed it with a patronizing smile. "Modern drugs are very reliable, Mr. Eldridge. You'll be completely unconscious." He wasn't. The propofol had paralyzed him, locked his body in stillness, but his mind remained crystalline and alert. He could hear everything: the beep of monitors, the shuffle of nurses' feet, the mechanical hum of equipment. He felt the scope slide down his throat, uncomfortable but bearable. Through slitted eyelids he couldn't quite close, he saw the blurred shapes of medical staff moving around him. Then he heard Dr. Bates' voice, low and urgent. "Is his wife still in the waiting room?" A female voice, a nurse, probably, responded. "Yes, doctor. She hasn't moved from her seat." "Good." There was a pause, the sound of something rustling. "Give her this envelope after I've finished here. Tell her I'm sorry it has to be this way." Marshall's paralyzed heart would have raced if it could. Every instinct screamed danger. "Should I tell her anything else?" the nurse asked. "No. She'll understand. We've been over this enough times." Bates' voice dropped even lower, barely audible over the equipment. "Make sure no one else sees it. Just her." The procedure continued. Marshall forced himself to remain completely still, to keep his breathing steady and deep. 23 years of poker games with ruthless business rivals had taught him how to maintain a perfect poker face. Now his life might depend on it. When they wheeled him into recovery, he kept his eyes closed, his breathing slow. He heard Tiffany's voice, syrupy with false concern. "How is he?" The procedure went smoothly, a different nurse said. "He should wake up within the hour. You can sit with him if you'd like." "Thank you. I will." Marshall felt her hand on his, cool and dry. She stroked his knuckles with her thumb, a gesture that had once comforted him. Now it felt like a serpent's touch. She sat with him for 20 minutes, her phone clicking softly as she typed messages. Then her phone rang. "I need to take this," she whispered to someone, probably a nurse. "I'll be right back." The moment her footsteps faded, Marshall cracked open his eyes. Her purse sat on the chair beside his bed, a large Prada bag, cream-colored leather. His paralysis was fading, control slowly returning to his limbs. He had maybe 5 minutes. His hand shook as he reached for the purse, adrenaline and residual drugs making him clumsy. He found the envelope immediately, thick, manila, unsealed. His name was written on it in Bates' handwriting. Marshall pulled out the contents with trembling fingers. The first document made his blood turn to ice. It was a falsified medical report on Peak Medical Center letterhead, dated today, diagnosing him with advanced pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Inoperable. Life expectancy, 3 to 6 months. The second document was worse, a consultation request for psychiatric evaluation, suggesting Marshall had become increasingly paranoid and delusional regarding his diagnosis, potentially a danger to himself. The third document was a life insurance policy he'd never seen before. $5 million. Beneficiary, Tiffany Eldridge. Dated 6 months ago, with his forged signature. The fourth made him understand the full scope of their plan. A signed DNR order, do not resuscitate, with his signature forged at the bottom. Dated yesterday. His hands clenched around the papers, rage and betrayal warring inside him. They were going to kill him. Make it look natural, like suicide or a tragic complication from terminal illness. Tiffany would play the grieving widow, collect millions, and walk away free. How long had she been planning this? Since the beginning? Had she ever loved him at all? Marshall heard footsteps approaching. With practiced efficiency born from years of high-stakes business deals, he photographed every document with his phone, replaced them in the envelope, and put it back in her purse. He closed his eyes and regulated his breathing just as Tiffany walked back in. Still sleeping, he heard her murmur to someone. Poor baby. Poor baby. The words that had once sounded affectionate now dripped with contempt. 15 minutes later, Marshall let himself wake up, groggy and disoriented. Tiffany was there instantly, her face a mask of concern that he now recognized as performance art. Hey, sweetheart, she cooed, brushing hair from his forehead. How do you feel? Tired, he mumbled, making his voice weak. Throat's sore. That's normal. Dr. Bates said everything went fine. He'll call us tomorrow with the results. She smiled, but her eyes were calculating. Let's get you home. In the car, Marshall pretended to doze while his mind raced. He noticed Tiffany checking her purse at a red light, pulling out the envelope discreetly, her face relaxing when she confirmed it was still there. At home, she helped him to bed with solicitous care, brought him water and soup he didn't eat. I'm going to run to the pharmacy to pick up your pain medication, she said. Will you be okay for a bit? I'll be fine, he said softly. Thank you for taking care of me. She kissed his forehead, and he fought the urge to recoil. Always, baby. I love you. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, Marshall was out of bed. He pulled out his phone and made a call to the one person he trusted absolutely. Keith Davis. Keith, it's Marshall Eldridge. I need you at my house immediately. We have a situation, and I need the best lawyer in Colorado. Marshall? What's wrong? I can't explain over the phone. How fast can you get here? There was a pause. Keith Davis had handled Marshall's business contracts for 8 years. They'd become friends, played golf together, shared bourbon and stories. Keith knew when Marshall was serious. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Good. And Keith? This conversation never happened. If anyone asks, you haven't heard from me. Marshall hung up and opened his laptop. He had work to do, evidence to preserve, and a plan to formulate. Tiffany and Dr. Bates had made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated him, and that mistake would cost them everything. Chapter 2, The Web Unravels. Keith Davis arrived 18 minutes later, his silver Audi pulling into Marshall's driveway with barely controlled urgency. He was a lean man in his early 50s, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, qualities that made him one of Denver's most formidable attorneys. Marshall met him at the door, still in his recovery clothes, but his eyes were clear and focused. Gone was the groggy patient. In his place stood the man who'd built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. Talk to me, Keith said, setting his briefcase on the kitchen island. Marshall handed him his phone, the photographs of the documents already queued up. Look at these. Take your time. Keith's expression grew darker with each swipe. When he finished, he looked up at Marshall with something close to shock. Jesus Christ. They're trying to murder you. That's my assessment. Marshall poured them both bourbon, Pappy Van Winkle, because if there was ever a time for the good stuff, this was it. The question is, what do we do about it? Keith took a long sip, his legal mind already working. First, we need to understand who we're dealing with. You said your wife recommended this doctor. Dr. Brian Bates. She claimed to know him from Chicago, said he helped her with digestive issues. Marshall pulled out his laptop. I'm already running searches. Give me a second. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Years of cybersecurity work had given him access to databases most people didn't know existed. Within minutes, he'd pulled up Brian Bates' history. Here we go, Marshall said, turning the screen. Dr. Brian Bates, gastroenterologist, licensed in Colorado for 3 years. Before that, Chicago for 8 years. Before that, he paused, his jaw tightening. Medical school at Northwestern, graduated 2009. Want to guess who else graduated from Northwestern in 2009? Keith leaned in. Your wife, Tiffany Underwood. Not as a doctor. She was in their hospital administration program. But same university, same year, same city. Marshall pulled up another window. And look at this. Brian Bates was married from 2010 to 2014. Divorce records show his wife's name was Sarah Stokes. Should that mean something? Sarah Stokes is listed as a witness on Tiffany's divorce papers from her first husband. They were roommates. Marshall's voice was cold, controlled. This isn't coincidence, Keith. This is a network. Keith's phone was already out. I'm calling Roy Vaughn. He's a private investigator, former FBI. If there's more to find, he'll find it. While Keith made the call, Marshall dug deeper. He accessed Tiffany's email, something he'd never done before, respecting her privacy. That respect died the moment he saw those forged documents. Her password was embarrassingly simple. Marshall 2021, the year they got married. The irony burned. The emails painted a damning picture. From Brian, Bates.md at peakmedical.com to tiff.eldridge@gmail.com. Date, 2 months ago. Subject, timeline. We need to move faster. He's starting to ask questions about the stomach pains. I can only prescribe the compound for another month before it becomes suspicious. Have you secured the insurance policy yet? Marshall's vision went red. They've been poisoning me. Keith looked up from his phone call. What? The stomach pains. It wasn't natural. They've been poisoning me to justify the medical procedures. He opened more emails, his anger growing with each revelation. Look at this. 3 months of planning, maybe more. Brian's been prescribing something, probably slipping it into supplements or vitamins. He checked the medicine cabinet in their bathroom. There, a bottle of digestive enzymes that Tiffany had recommended 2 months ago. These help with your stomach acid, baby, she'd said. Marshall photographed the bottle, then kept searching. Roy's on his way, Keith said. Marshall, we need to think strategically here. If we go to the police now with what we have, it might be enough for an investigation, but these people could lawyer up, destroy evidence, flee. We need ironclad proof. I know. Marshall was already thinking 3 steps ahead. And I intend to get it. But not by playing defense. What do you mean? They think I'm clueless. They think I'm a mark, a victim waiting to be slaughtered. Marshall's eyes were hard as flint. We're going to let them think that. But we're going to control the game. Keith studied his friend. You want to disappear. I want to die, Marshall corrected. At least, I want them to think I did. And then I want to watch them hang themselves with their own rope. The doorbell rang. Keith went to answer it while Marshall continued his research. Roy Vaughn entered the kitchen, a compact man in his 40s with the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen humanity's worst and learned to spot lies from across a room. Marshall briefed him quickly, showing him the documents and emails. Roy's expression never changed, but his fingers drummed a steady rhythm on the counter, a tell that meant his mind was working overtime. How much time do we have? Roy asked. Tiffany will be back soon. We need to act like everything's normal. Marshall checked his watch. But I need information. Everything you can find on Brian Bates, Tiffany, and this Sarah Stokes. I want to know if they've done this before. Give me 72 hours, Roy said. But Marshall, if what you're suggesting is true, if this is a pattern, you might not be the first. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Then find out, Marshall said quietly. Find out how many men they've killed. Over the next 3 days, Marshall played the perfect recovering patient. He took the pills Tiffany gave him, but palmed them when she wasn't looking and photographed each one. He grew weaker, complained of fatigue and confusion. He could see the satisfaction in Tiffany's eyes every time he stumbled or seemed disoriented. Maybe we should get you checked out again, she suggested on the 3rd day, her voice dripping with false concern. You just don't seem right. I'm fine, he said, deliberately slurring his words slightly. Just need rest. Dr. Bates wants to see you tomorrow for a follow-up, she pressed. Just to make sure everything's okay. Okay, he agreed meekly. Whatever you think is best. That night, while Tiffany slept beside him, how had he ever found comfort in that? Marshall received an encrypted message from Roy. Found 3. Different cities. Similar MO. All wealthy men. All died within 6 months of marrying women connected to Tiffany and Bates. 1 in Chicago, 1 in Phoenix, 1 in Seattle. Deaths ruled natural. Heart attack, stroke, suicide. Police never investigated. I'm digging into the life insurance payouts. This is bigger than we thought. Marshall read the message 3 times, each word stoking the cold fury building inside him. 3 men. 3 families destroyed. 3 murderers walking free, living on blood money. Not anymore. He typed his response. Tomorrow I disappear. Are you ready? Ready. Equipment in place. I'll handle the logistics. Keith has the legal framework prepared. Just stick to the plan. Marshall looked at Tiffany sleeping beside him, her face peaceful, innocent in repose. He wondered if she dreamed, if she felt any remorse, if she ever had. Then he remembered the emails, the casual way she and Brian discussed the timeline and securing the payout. He remembered the 3 dead men Roy had found, the widows they'd left behind who probably never knew the truth. His decision crystallized into diamond-hard certainty. Tomorrow, Marshall Eldridge would die, and his murderers would learn what it meant to face someone who always thought 10 steps ahead. Chapter 3. The Vanishing. The follow-up appointment was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Peak Medical Center. Marshall wore his weakness like a costume, shuffling to the car with Tiffany's help, letting her buckle his seatbelt as if he couldn't manage it himself. You're going to be okay, sweetheart, she murmured, her hand lingering on his chest. Dr. Bates will figure out what's wrong. He already knows, Marshall thought, because he's the one doing it. But he just nodded weakly and closed his eyes for the drive. Roy Vaughn had spent the previous night setting up surveillance throughout the medical center, tiny cameras disguised as smoke detectors, audio bugs in Bates' office, GPS trackers, the works. Everything they needed to document what happened next. Keith Davis had prepared the legal groundwork, power of attorney transfers, encrypted evidence dumps scheduled to send to multiple law enforcement agencies if Marshall didn't check in every 6 hours. Offshore accounts activated and ready. If this went wrong, if they killed him for Betrayal, the truth would still come out. But Marshall didn't intend for it to go wrong. They arrived at the medical center, and Tiffany helped him inside. Dr. Bates greeted them with professional warmth that made Marshall's skin crawl. Mr. Eldridge, good to see you. How are you feeling? Not great, Doctor. Marshall admitted, playing his role perfectly. Weak, confused sometimes. My wife's worried. Well, let's run some tests and see what's going on. Bates smiled at Tiffany, a smile that lasted a fraction too long. Mrs. Eldridge, this might take a while. You're welcome to wait in the lounge. Actually, Tiffany said, I need to run a quick errand. Marshall, will you be okay? Marshall nodded mutely. He watched her leave, watched the way Bates watched her leave, and saw the unspoken communication pass between them. The nurse led him to an examination room. Different nurse than before, younger, clearly nervous. Part of the conspiracy or just an unwitting pawn? Marshall couldn't tell yet. Bates entered, closing the door behind him. His demeanor changed instantly, the warm professionalism replaced by cold calculation. Let's make this quick, Marshall. No more Mr. Eldridge. I'm going to give you an injection. Potassium chloride. It'll stop your heart within minutes, mimic a cardiac event. With your deteriorating condition, no one will question it. Marshall stared at him, letting fear show in his eyes. What? I don't understand. You don't need to understand. Bates prepared a syringe, his back to Marshall. Your wife's been very patient, but we're on a timeline. The insurance company is starting to ask questions about that policy. This needs to happen today. Tiffany, she knows. Bates laughed, actually laughed. Whose idea do you think this was? She's very good at finding wealthy, lonely men. You were perfect, successful, no close family, so desperate for love after your divorce that you didn't ask enough questions. He turned, syringe in hand. You're victim number 4, by the way. You should feel honored. The others went much messier. We've really perfected the process. Marshall's heart hammered, but not from fear. From rage. From the satisfaction of knowing every word was being recorded by 6 different devices Roy had planted. Any last words? Bates moved closer. Yes, Marshall said, his voice suddenly clear and strong. I'm curious. When did you figure out I was conscious during the endoscopy? Bates froze. What? The envelope. The conversation with the nurse. I heard every word. Marshall stood, steady as a rock, no trace of weakness in his movements. I've been awake for 3 days, Brian. Playing possum while I build a case that's going to bury you so deep you'll never see daylight again. The color drained from Bates' face. You're bluffing. Am I? Marshall smiled, cold, predatory. Let's find out. Roy. The door burst open. Roy Vaughn entered with 2 uniformed police officers, followed by Keith Davis holding a tablet displaying live video feeds. Dr. Brian Bates, one officer said, you're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Bates lunged with the syringe, but Roy moved faster, years of FBI training kicking in. He caught Bates' wrist, twisted, and the syringe clattered to the floor. The officers had him cuffed within seconds. We've got everything, Keith said, holding up the tablet. 3 days of recorded conversations, emails, financial records, and, thanks to your confession just now, premeditated murder. The DA is going to have a field day with this. Where's Tiffany? Marshall asked. Being arrested at your house as we speak, Roy said. She went straight there to start packing valuables. We've got her on camera with stolen goods, and Detective Chun is very interested in those life insurance documents. Marshall watched them drag Bates away, the doctor's face twisted with rage and disbelief. He felt no satisfaction yet, only cold purpose. This was just the beginning. At Marshall's house, Tiffany Eldridge was having the worst day of her life. She'd been loading jewelry into a suitcase. Her jewelry now, she'd thought smugly, along with everything else Marshall owned, when the police knocked. At first, she'd tried charm, then confusion, then outrage. None of it worked. Detective Lisa Chun was a 20-year veteran who'd seen every con and heard every lie. She read Tiffany her rights while other officers secured the scene, photographing the forged documents Tiffany had hidden in the back of her closet, the burner phones she'd used to communicate with Bates, the detailed timeline she'd stupidly kept of their plan. I want a lawyer, Tiffany finally said, her mask cracking. Smart, Chin said. You're going to need the best one you can afford. Which, ironically, won't be very good since we're freezing all your assets, including the life insurance money you were so eager to collect. This is a mistake. My husband is sick. Your husband is fine. In fact, he's at the police station right now, giving his statement. Funny thing, he doesn't seem sick at all anymore. Almost like someone was poisoning him. Chin smiled without warmth. But I'm sure your lawyer will explain how that works. Tiffany's face went white as the reality crashed over her. They knew. Everything. Somehow, Marshall had figured it out. How? She whispered. That's the fun part, Chin said, leading her to the patrol car. He never fell for it. Not for a second. You played a game with a man who's smarter than you, richer than you, and, here's the kicker, actually has a conscience. You never stood a chance. Marshall stood in the observation room at the Denver Police Department, watching through one-way glass as they processed Tiffany and Bates into separate interrogation rooms. Roy stood beside him, along with Keith and Detective Chun. We've got enough for multiple murder charges, Chin said. The 3 previous victims Roy identified. We're reopening all those cases. With what we have now, we can build solid cases for conspiracy to commit murder, possibly prove the actual murders. The families deserve justice, Marshall said quietly. They'll get it. Chin turned to him. You did good work here, Mr. Eldridge. Risky but good. It was the only way to catch them in the act. Marshall watched Tiffany through the glass, saw her crying, pleading with the officers. Crocodile tears. What happens now? Now they lawyer up, and we build the prosecution. With your evidence and their confessions on tape, the DA is confident we're looking at life sentences. Multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, practicing medicine with intent to harm. Chin ticked them off on her fingers. They're done. Marshall nodded, but felt hollow. Justice was coming, yes. But 3 men were still dead. Families were still destroyed. And he'd been days away from becoming victim number 4. There's something else, Roy said, pulling up his phone. I dug into Tiffany's past. Found her real name, Carla Conway. She's got a record under that name. Fraud, identity theft. She's been running cons since she was 25. And Bates? Marshall asked. Medical license suspended twice for ethics violations before he moved to Colorado. Married 3 times, all divorced within 2 years. Financial records show large deposits coinciding with the deaths Roy uncovered. So this was his business model, Keith said grimly. Find vulnerable wealthy men, marry them off to Tiffany or someone like her, then cash in. Looks that way. Roy closed his phone. The good news is, with Tiffany's real identity, we can trace her network. There might be others, accomplices, other victims we haven't found yet. Marshall took a deep breath. Find them all. Every victim, every accomplice. I want the entire operation exposed. Marshall, Keith said carefully, this is going to get messy. The media will have a field day. Your privacy. I don't care about privacy. Marshall's voice was steel. I care about making sure they never do this to anyone else. Through the glass, Tiffany looked up suddenly, as if sensing she was being watched. For a moment, her eyes seemed to lock directly on Marshall's. The mask was completely gone now, replaced by cold hatred. Marshall stared back, unflinching. He'd spent 3 days pretending to be weak, pretending to be dying. But he'd never been the victim they thought he was. He was Marshall Eldridge, builder of companies, solver of impossible problems, survivor of their best attempt to destroy him. And he was just getting started. Chapter 4. Ghosts and Revelations. The story broke 3 days later. Wealthy Denver executive narrowly escapes murder plot. Wife and doctor arrested in scheme that may have claimed multiple victims. Marshall's phone exploded with calls from reporters, business associates, old friends he hadn't spoken to in years. He ignored them all, focusing instead on the work that mattered. Roy Vaughn had become a permanent fixture in Marshall's home office, surrounded by whiteboards covered in names, dates, and connecting lines. The investigation had metastasized beyond anyone's initial expectations. For confirmed victims, Roy said, pointing to photographs pinned to the board. Not 3. We found another one in San Diego from 6 years ago. Zachary Riley, 48, tech entrepreneur. Married a woman named Lou Bautista, who we've now identified as another alias for someone in Tiffany's network. Died of a heart attack 3 months after signing a $3 million life insurance policy. Marshall studied the photograph. Zachary had been younger than him, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Dead at 48 because he'd made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. Lou Bautista, Marshall repeated. Where is she now? Gone. Disappeared after collecting the insurance money. But we found connections, emails between her and Tiffany, money transfers to a shell company that Brian Bates was linked to. Roy pulled up bank records on his laptop. This goes back at least a decade, Marshall. Maybe longer. Keith Davis entered carrying coffee and a stack of legal documents. The DA just filed additional charges. They're adding RICO statutes, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. This isn't just murder anymore. It's an organized criminal enterprise. Good, Marshall said. What about the other women? The accomplices? We've identified 5 so far, Roy said, switching to another document. Tiffany, Lou Bautista, Sarah Stokes, and 2 others, Adrian Donahue and Elaine Stokes. Sarah's sister. They've been working together, probably recruiting vulnerable women and indoctrinating them into the operation. How did we not see this pattern before? Keith asked. Different cities, different names, different apparent causes of death, Roy explained. And they were smart. They waited years between hits, changed their methods, used different doctors. Bates wasn't their only medical accomplice. We've found links to at least 2 other physicians in other states. Marshall felt his jaw clench. So this is bigger than just Bates and Tiffany. Much bigger. Roy zoomed in on a financial flowchart. We're tracking approximately $15 million in life insurance payouts over 10 years, split among various members of the network. This wasn't just about getting rich. This was their career. The doorbell rang. Marshall checked the security camera. A woman in her early 50s, well-dressed, clutching a purse like a lifeline. I'll get it, he said. The woman's eyes were red from crying, but she held herself together with visible effort. Mr. Eldridge? My name is Christina Roman. I think your wife might have killed my husband. Marshall ushered her inside, his heart aching. Roy and Keith stood as she entered, professional sympathy on their faces. Please, sit down, Marshall said gently. Tell us what happened. Christina's story spilled out in a rush. Her husband, Jim Spencer, had died 4 years ago. A stroke, the doctors said. Sudden, unexpected. He'd been only 46, healthy, athletic. But 6 weeks before his death, he'd married a woman he'd met at a conference. A woman who'd swept into his life like a whirlwind, convinced him she was his soulmate. Her name was Melissa, Christina said, her voice breaking. At least, that's what she called herself. Jim was so happy. We'd been divorced for 2 years, but we were still friends. He wanted me to meet her, said she was perfect. She wiped her eyes. Then he died. And Melissa disappeared. Just vanished. Took the life insurance money and his savings and was gone within a month. Roy was already typing on his laptop. Do you have a photo of Melissa? Christina pulled out her phone, hands shaking. Just one. From Jim's Facebook. The photo showed a happy couple at a restaurant. Jim Spencer with his arm around a dark-haired woman with an infectious smile. That's Adrian Donahue, Roy said grimly. One of the women in the network. Christina's face crumpled. So it's true. She really did kill him. We believe so, Marshall said softly. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for your loss. I thought I was going crazy, Christina whispered. Everyone said I was being paranoid, that Jim just had bad luck. But I knew something was wrong. The way Melissa acted after he died. No grief, just efficient. Calculating. I tried to get the police to investigate, but they said there was no evidence of foul play. There is now, Keith said firmly. And we're going to make sure your husband gets justice. Over the next week, they came in waves, the families of the dead. Eduardo Harvey's brother, Donnie Richmond, who'd lost his sibling to a suicide that never made sense. Eduardo had been happy, successful, newly engaged to a woman named Jasmine Hines. Then he'd jumped off a building, or so the report said. Jasmine had inherited everything and vanished. Clyde Sellers' daughter, Kathy Lyons, who was only 12 when her father died of a mysterious illness shortly after remarrying. She was 23 now, still haunted by questions about the stepmother who disappeared immediately after the funeral. Each story was a variation on the same theme. Wealthy man, whirlwind romance, quick marriage, sudden death, disappearing widow. Each family had been told they were paranoid, that grief was making them see conspiracies where there was only tragedy. But Marshall knew better. He'd almost been one of those tragedies. We're up to 9 confirmed victims, Roy reported on day 8. And we've identified 7 different women in the network, all using multiple aliases. The financial trail shows $23 million moved through various shell companies and offshore accounts over 12 years. How many of these women can we locate? Marshall asked. 4 are in custody: Tiffany, Sarah Stokes, Adrian Donahue, and Elaine Stokes. The others have gone to ground. But with RICO charges pending and multiple murder warrants, they won't stay hidden forever. Keith looked up from his notes. Marshall, the DA wants you to testify before the grand jury next week. Your case is the one with the most concrete evidence, recordings, documents, direct confession from Bates. They want to use it as the foundation for the larger prosecution. I'll be there, Marshall said without hesitation. There's something else, Roy said carefully. The media attention, it's drawing out more potential victims. People whose spouses died under suspicious circumstances, people who were conned but survived. The DA's office is getting calls every day. How many? Last count. 43 possible cases going back 15 years. The number hit Marshall like a physical blow. 43 families. 43 lives destroyed or damaged. And he'd been so focused on his own near death that he hadn't fully grasped the scope. We need to help them, he said. All of them. Marshall, Keith began. You're not responsible. I know I'm not responsible. But I have the resources, the platform, and the inside knowledge to help bring these people down. Marshall stood, pacing to the window. I almost died, Keith. I almost became another statistic, another mysterious death that families would whisper about at funerals. But I didn't die. And that means I have an obligation to the ones who weren't as lucky. Christina Roman spoke up from where she'd been quietly listening. Mr. Eldridge, if I may, my husband didn't have your resources or your instincts. He was a good man, but he trusted too easily. He never saw it coming. Her voice strengthened. If you're serious about helping, about exposing this entire network, then count me in. Whatever you need. And me, said Donnie Richmond. Eduardo deserves justice. All of them do, Kathy Lyons added, her young face set with determination beyond her years. Marshall looked at the families gathered in his home, People bound together by tragedy and betrayal, but also by the refusal to let evil win. He thought of Zachary Riley, Jim Spencer, Eduardo Harvey, Clyde Sellers. Men he'd never met, but whose stories had become woven into his own. Then we don't just prosecute the ones we have, he said. We hunt down every single person involved in this network. We expose every scam, track every dollar, and we make sure the whole world knows what they did. Roy grinned, fierce and predatory. Now you're speaking my language. There's one more thing, Marshall said, turning to face them all. Tiffany and Bates think this is over. They think they've been caught, and that's the end of the story. But they don't know about the others we've identified. They don't know we've connected all the dots. What are you suggesting? Keith asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. I'm suggesting we use that. Marshall's eyes were cold. Let them think we only know about my case. Let them think they can cut deals, turn on each other, maybe even get lighter sentences. And while they're comfortable in that delusion, we build the RICO case that puts them away forever, Roy finished. Exactly. Marshall looked at each person in the room. But I need to know, all of you, are you prepared for what this means? This could take months, maybe years. The media attention will be intense. Your privacy will evaporate. The defense attorneys will try to destroy your credibility. My husband is dead because of these people, Christina said simply. I'll walk through fire if it means they pay for it. The others nodded in agreement. Marshall felt something shift inside him. The last remnants of the trusting man he'd been burning away, replaced by something harder, sharper. He'd built companies by being smart and relentless. Now he'd destroy a criminal empire the same way. Then let's get to work, he said. Chapter 5, The Trap Titans. The grand jury hearing took place in a secured courtroom, with Marshall as the star witness. He'd prepared meticulously, rehearsing his testimony with Keith until every word was perfect, every emotion calibrated for maximum impact. The prosecutors led him through the timeline, meeting Tiffany, the courtship, the marriage, the symptoms that started appearing. The endoscopy. The moment he'd heard Bates and the nurse discussing the envelope. Mr. Eldridge, can you tell the jury what you were thinking when you heard that conversation? Assistant District Attorney Melinda Turner asked. I thought I was about to die, Marshall said simply. And I thought my wife was going to get away with killing me. He described finding the envelope, photographing the documents, the decision to pretend ignorance while he gathered evidence. The grand jurors leaned forward, riveted. Why didn't you go to the police immediately? Turner asked. Because I needed proof that would hold up in court. A few forged documents weren't enough. They could claim I fabricated them, or that it was a misunderstanding. I needed their confession, their plan laid out in their own words. Marshall looked directly at the jurors. I needed them to tell me they'd done this before. To other men. To prove this wasn't a one-time crime of passion, but a calculated, repeated pattern of murder for profit. The grand jury indicted on all counts. Murder conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud, racketeering. The list ran 3 pages long. But Marshall's work was just beginning. While the prosecution built their case against Tiffany and Bates, Marshall and Roy pursued the wider network. They'd set up a dedicated office, hired additional investigators, and established a victim support hotline that was receiving calls from across the country. We've got a break, Roy announced, bursting into the office on a Tuesday morning. Lou Bautista. We found her. Marshall looked up from the financial records he'd been reviewing. Where? Mexico. Puerto Vallarta, living under the name Lucia Ross. Local police picked her up this morning on our warrant. She's being extradited. Has she said anything? Only that she wants to make a deal. Roy's expression was grim. Apparently, she's willing to testify against the others if we reduce her charges. Marshall exchanged a look with Keith, who'd become a permanent fixture in the investigation. Set up a meeting, Marshall said. I want to hear what she has to say. The meeting took place 3 days later in a secure conference room at the Denver Police Department. Lou Bautista, or Lucia Ross, or whatever her real name was, sat across from them in an orange jumpsuit, her lawyer beside her. She was 42, attractive in a calculated way, with dark hair and sharp eyes that constantly evaluated everyone in the room. I'll cooperate fully, she said without preamble. But I want immunity from prosecution for any murders I wasn't directly involved in, and a maximum sentence of 10 years for the ones I was. That's not happening, Melinda Turner said flatly. You're looking at multiple life sentences. The best I can offer is consecutive instead of concurrent if you give us information leading to arrests and convictions of the other network members. Lou's facade cracked slightly. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This organization. We understand perfectly, Marshall interrupted. He'd been silent until now, just watching. You're part of a murder-for-hire network that's been operating for at least 15 years. You marry wealthy men, kill them, collect the insurance, and move on. We've documented 43 possible cases and confirmed 9. You personally killed Zachary Riley in San Diego 6 years ago. Lou paled. That wasn't murder. He had a heart condition. He had a heart condition because you and your doctor accomplice gave him digitalis poisoning over 3 months, gradually increasing the dose until his heart gave out. Marshall slid a folder across the table. We exhumed his body. The toxicology report is very clear. The lawyer grabbed the folder, his face going white as he read. Lou, don't say anything else. It wasn't my idea. Lou burst out. The network recruited me. I was just trying to survive after my own divorce left me broke. They promised easy money, said the men deserved it for being stupid and trusting. Sarah Stokes recruited me, trained me, introduced me to the doctors who would help. Names, Turner said, pen poised. We want every name, every location, every detail you can remember. Lou took a shaky breath. There are 12 women that I know of. Maybe more. Sarah and Elaine Stokes run the operation. They've been doing this the longest, since the early 2000s. They recruit women who are desperate or angry, usually after bad divorces or financial troubles. They teach them how to identify marks, how to build false identities, how to romance wealthy men quickly. And the doctors? Marshall asked. There's a network of them too. Physicians who got in trouble with licensing boards, who need money, who have flexible ethics. Lou's voice was bitter. Brian Bates was one of the newer ones. The original doctor was someone named Tony Costello, a surgeon in Chicago. He's dead now, but he trained the others. Roy was typing furiously, recording everything. How many murders are we talking about? Lou closed her eyes. I don't know the exact number. Each woman works independently, but we share resources, false identity documents, offshore accounts, the doctors. In the 10 years I was active, I heard about maybe 30 successful operations, but there could be more I didn't know about. 30. The number echoed in the silent room. Who decides the targets? Keith asked. We do. Each woman finds her own marks, but Sarah has to approve them. She runs background checks, makes sure they're wealthy enough to be worth it, isolated enough that there won't be too much scrutiny. No kids if possible. Kids ask questions. Divorced men are ideal, or widowers. Lonely, vulnerable, eager for companionship. Marshall felt sick. That described him perfectly. He'd been the ideal mark. Wealthy, divorced, no children, eager to build a new life. Tiffany had seen him coming from a mile away. The men who survived, Turner pressed. The ones where the operation failed or was aborted. Do you have names? Some. Lou pulled out her phone. The lawyer started to object, but she waved him off. I kept records. Insurance. I knew if this ever fell apart, I'd need leverage. She handed over the phone. Roy immediately plugged it into his laptop, copying the data. This is gold. Messages, financial records, names, dates. This could break the whole thing open. There's something else, Lou said quietly. The money doesn't just disappear. Sarah's been investing it, building legitimate businesses as fronts. Real estate in Phoenix, a medical supplies company in Dallas, even a dating app startup in San Francisco. Marshall's head snapped up. A dating app? How do you think we found Mark so efficiently? The app matches wealthy older men with younger women, provides detailed profiles including financial information. Sarah's team monitors it, identifies the best targets, and sends in one of the women. Lou smiled bitterly. It's called second chance romance. Ironic, right? Jesus Christ, Keith breathed. They've been farming victims through a dating app and making money from both sides, the subscription fees and the eventual insurance payouts. Lou's lawyer was furiously taking notes, probably realizing his client's immunity deal was dead in the water. Sarah's a genius. Evil, but a genius. Marshall stood, needing to move. Where is Sarah Stokes now? Custody, Turner said. We arrested her with Tiffany, but we didn't know the full scope until now. She's been playing like she was just an accomplice, that she didn't know the full plan. She's the mastermind, Lou said flatly. Tiffany, me, all the others, we're soldiers. Sarah's the general. And her sister Elaine handles the financial side, moves money around, creates the shell companies. And Elaine is still out there, Roy said, checking his laptop. We don't have her location. Lou leaned forward. If I give you everything I know about Elaine's operations, her accounts, her safe houses, do I get a deal? Turner looked at Marshall, a question in her eyes. This wasn't really his call, but everyone in the room knew his word carried weight. Marshall thought about Zachary Riley, about the 43 families, about the men still in danger from dating apps, and charming women and doctors willing to kill for money. Give us everything, he said coldly. And maybe, you'll die in prison instead of on death row. Lou flinched but nodded. Deal. The information Lou provided unraveled the network like pulling a thread from a sweater. Over the next 6 weeks, arrests happened in waves. Women using false identities were picked up in Miami, Seattle, Houston, Phoenix. Doctors who'd written suspicious prescriptions found themselves under investigation. Shell companies were raided, bank accounts frozen. But Elaine Stokes remained in the wind. She's smart, Roy said, studying the board they'd built of the network. The moment Sarah was arrested, Elaine knew to run. She's probably been preparing for this scenario for years. Then we need to think like her, Marshall said. She's got money, resources, probably multiple identities prepared. Where would she go? Somewhere without extradition, Keith suggested. Brazil, maybe. Or Russia. But Marshall shook his head. No. She's an engineer, a builder. She wouldn't abandon her empire entirely. She'd go somewhere she could rebuild, somewhere with weak financial oversight but modern infrastructure. He pulled up a map. Let's look at her financial transactions over the last year. Find patterns. Roy worked his magic, tracking wire transfers, property purchases, business registrations. A picture emerged, a web of investments centered in 3 locations: Panama City, Dubai, and Singapore. Dubai, Marshall said with certainty. It's the perfect balance: wealth, modern infrastructure, and historically loose attitudes toward white-collar crime from foreigners. She's there. Based on what evidence? Turner asked. Marshall pointed to a series of property purchases. She bought 3 luxury condos in Dubai over the last 18 months. That's not investment diversification. That's preparing bolt holes. And look at this. He pulled up another document. She registered a consulting company there 4 months ago. She's been planning her exit strategy. Roy was already on the phone with international law enforcement. I've got contacts at Interpol. If she's in Dubai, we can get local police to locate her. Can we extradite from the UAE? Keith asked. Depends on the crime and the politics, Turner admitted. But we have to try. The call came 3 days later. Elaine Stokes had been located at a luxury hotel in Dubai, living under the name Elizabeth Sterling. She was fighting extradition, had hired expensive lawyers, was claiming political persecution. But Marshall had one more card to play. He scheduled a video call with Elaine, facilitated by her lawyers. She appeared on screen, a woman in her late 40s, elegant and composed, with steel gray hair and cold blue eyes. Mr. Eldridge, she said pleasantly, I've heard so much about you. Congratulations on surviving my sister's rather sloppy work. I didn't call to exchange pleasantries, Marshall said. I called to offer you a choice. Oh, Elaine sipped what looked like expensive wine. And what choice is that? Return voluntarily and cooperate with the prosecution. Tell us everything, every victim, every accomplice, every detail of the operation. In exchange, we'll recommend concurrent sentences instead of consecutive. Or we continue building our case, piece by piece, until we have enough evidence to convince Dubai authorities to extradite you. And when you're finally in custody, and you will be eventually, you'll face every single charge with maximum sentences. Death penalty if possible. Elaine laughed. You're bluffing. You don't have the evidence for death penalty charges. Don't I? Marshall pulled up a file on his screen. Zachary Riley, Jim Spencer, Eduardo Harvey. We've exhumed all of them. Toxicology shows deliberate poisoning over extended periods. Colorado has capital punishment for premeditated murder with special circumstances. A killing-for-profit scheme with multiple victims absolutely qualifies. For the first time, Elaine's composure cracked. Those cases are old. Contaminated evidence. Modern forensics are amazing, Marshall interrupted. And we have your financial records showing you profited from every single death. We have Lou Bautista's testimony detailing your role as the architect of the entire operation. We have Sarah's emails to you discussing targets and timelines. Sarah would never testify against me. Are you sure about that? Marshall pulled up another file, a video of Sarah Stokes in her jail cell, being informed that Elaine had fled the country and left her holding the bag. Sarah's rage was visceral, immediate. She knows you abandoned her, and she's very interested in making sure you pay for that. Elaine's hand tightened on her wine glass. What exactly are you offering? Life in prison instead of death. Some small measure of dignity instead of being executed like the serial killer you are. Marshall leaned forward. You built this empire, Elaine. You turned murder into a business model. But it's over now. The only question is whether you go out fighting or cooperate. The silence stretched. Elaine stared at him through the screen, calculating, evaluating. Finally, she spoke. I want it in writing. Immunity from death penalty, concurrent sentences, protective custody separate from Sarah and the others. Done, Turner said, appearing beside Marshall. We'll have the documents prepared within 24 hours. Then I'll return voluntarily. Elaine's smile was bitter. Though I suppose I should congratulate you, Mr. Eldridge. You've destroyed in 3 months what took me 15 years to build. I didn't destroy anything, Marshall said quietly. You destroyed it the moment you decided killing people was an acceptable business model. I just made sure the world found out. The call ended. Marshall sat back, exhausted but satisfied. They had her. They had all of them. That was risky, Keith said. What if she'd called our bluff about the death penalty? It wasn't a bluff, Marshall said. I was prepared to spend the next 5 years making sure she faced capital charges, if that's what it took. But she knew that, and she blinked first. Roy closed his laptop with a satisfied click. 12 women in custody, for doctors arrested, 23 million in assets frozen, and 43 families finally getting answers. Not bad for 3 months' work. It's not over yet, Marshall said. We still have trials, testimony, the possibility of appeals. This could take years. Then we take years, Christina Roman said from the doorway. She'd become a fixture in the investigation, representing the families of victims. However long it takes, we see this through. Marshall nodded. However long it takes. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Foundation. The first trial, the state of Colorado versus Tiffany Eldridge and Brian Bates, began 4 months after Marshall's near-death experience. The prosecution had decided to try them together, arguing their crimes were inextricably linked. Marshall sat in the courtroom every day, a silent presence in the gallery. He wanted them to see him, to be reminded that their plan had failed. Tiffany's defense attorney, a slick lawyer named Jim Spencer, no relation to the victim with the same name, tried to paint her as a victim herself. Manipulated by Bates, controlled by the mysterious network, coerced into participating against her will. My client is not a master criminal, Spencer argued. She's a woman who fell under the influence of predatory individuals and made terrible choices. But she never intended to kill anyone. The prosecution destroyed that narrative with brutal efficiency. They played the recordings of Tiffany and Bates discussing the timeline and securing the payout. They showed emails where Tiffany casually referenced previous victims, comparing notes on what had worked and what hadn't. They brought in Lou Bautista, who testified that Tiffany had bragged about being the best closer in the network. She said Marshall was almost too easy, Lou testified. That he was so desperate for love after his divorce that he barely questioned anything. She called him the perfect Mark. Marshall kept his face expressionless, but the words cut deep. He'd known logically that Tiffany had never loved him, but hearing it stated so bluntly still hurt. The defense tried to attack his credibility during cross-examination. Mr. Eldridge, Spencer said with false sympathy, isn't it true that you were under the influence of anesthesia during this alleged conversation between Dr. Bates and the nurse? I was paralyzed but conscious, Marshall corrected. My body doesn't metabolize propofol the way most people's do. I've had similar experiences with sedation before. But you can't prove you were truly conscious, can you? This could all be a false memory, a hallucination brought on by the drugs. The recordings prove I was conscious, Marshall said calmly. The bugs planted in Dr. Bates' office captured him confessing to the plan. Those weren't hallucinations. Those were his actual words, recorded on 6 different devices. Spencer tried another angle. Isn't it true that you have a history of paranoia? That you've always been suspicious of people's motives? Objection, Melinda Turner called. Relevance. I'm establishing that Mr. Eldridge's perception of events may have been colored by pre-existing trust issues. I'll allow it, the judge said. But get to your point quickly, counselor. Marshall turned to face Spencer directly. I'm not paranoid. I'm careful. There's a difference. And in this case, my caution saved my life. Or your paranoia created a conspiracy where none existed, and you've trapped innocent people. Innocent. Marshall's voice was steel. Your client and her accomplices murdered at least 9 men, possibly many more. They built an entire criminal enterprise around identifying wealthy, lonely men and killing them for profit. If you think that's innocent, counselor, you and I have very different definitions of the word. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, and Spencer retreated, his attack blunted. The trial continued for 3 weeks. Expert witnesses testified about the forged documents, the fake insurance policy, the poisoning regime Marshall had been subjected to. The pills Tiffany had been giving him were analyzed. They contained a cocktail of substances designed to cause weakness, confusion, and gastrointestinal distress. The goal, the toxicologist explained, was to make Mr. Eldridge genuinely sick enough that his death would seem plausible, but not so sick that he'd seek extensive medical care outside Dr. Bates' supervision. Brian Bates' defense was even weaker. His attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming Bates had been addicted to prescription drugs and not in his right mind. But the prosecution produced years of financial records showing Bates had been carefully, methodically profiting from the murders. He'd kept detailed notes on each victim, documenting symptoms, medication regimens, and projected timelines for death. These aren't the actions of someone with diminished capacity, Turner argued. These are the meticulous records of a serial killer who used his medical license as a weapon. On the 15th day of trial, something unexpected happened. Tiffany cracked. She was on the stand, being cross-examined about an email she'd sent to Sarah Stokes discussing Marshall's finances. Spencer had objected to the line of questioning, but the judge overruled him. Ms. Eldridge, Turner said, in this email, you wrote, Marshall's estate is worth approximately $12 million after the insurance payout. I'll need to move quickly on the house sale to avoid probate issues. What did you mean by that? I was just thinking ahead, planning for worst-case scenarios. Worst-case scenarios? Your husband dying of pancreatic cancer is a worst-case scenario. I meant, if something happened. Something like murder? Turner pressed. Something like the plan you and Dr. Bates had been crafting for months? No, I never wanted him dead. I loved him. You loved him so much that you discussed selling his house before he was even in the ground. Turner pulled up another email. Or is this love? Once Marshall's gone, I'm thinking Maui for a month. Somewhere to decompress and celebrate. Celebrate what, Ms. Eldridge? Tiffany's composure shattered. Tears streamed down her face. Real tears this time, not the calculated performances she'd given earlier. You don't understand, she sobbed. I didn't have a choice. Sarah said if I didn't go through with it, she'd expose everything. She had evidence of the others. She said she'd make sure I went down alone. The courtroom went silent. Spencer was on his feet, shouting objections, trying to stop his client from continuing. But Tiffany was past caring. I never wanted to kill anyone. But after the first time, they had me. I couldn't stop. They'd use what I'd done to force me to do it again and again. I wanted out, but Sarah said there was no out. Not unless I wanted to spend my life in prison. Turner moved in for the kill. The first time. You're referring to your first husband? The one you said died in a car accident. Tiffany's face went white. No, I didn't mean. Your first husband, Chris Mackenzie, died in Denver 5 years before you met Mr. Eldridge. The police ruled it an accident, brake failure while driving in the mountains. But it was murder, wasn't it? Your first kill. It was an accident. The mechanic said. The mechanic who was later convicted of taking bribes from Sarah Stokes' organization to file false reports? Turner pulled up yet another document. The mechanic who testified yesterday that he was paid $50,000 to sabotage Chris Mackenzie's car and make it look like natural brake failure? Tiffany collapsed on the stand, sobbing uncontrollably. Her attorney was frantically requesting a recess, but the damage was done. She'd admitted to murder. On the record, in front of a jury. The trial ended 2 days later. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts for both defendants. At sentencing, the families of the victims were allowed to speak. Christina Roman spoke about Jim Spencer, about the hole his death had left in their children's lives. Donnie Richmond spoke about Eduardo, about dreams cut short and futures stolen. Kathy Lyons, now 23 and studying criminal justice, spoke about her father Clyde and how his murder had shaped her entire life. Marshall spoke last. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I stand before you as one of the lucky ones. I survived. I got to fight back, to seek justice, to see my would-be killers brought to account. 9 other men didn't get that chance. Zachary Riley, Jim Spencer, Eduardo Harvey, Clyde Sellers, and 5 others we've identified. They're dead. Their families are broken. Their futures are gone. But I'm not here asking for vengeance. I'm here asking for justice. Justice that says killing people for profit is unacceptable. Justice that says using trust and love as weapons to destroy lives will not be tolerated. Justice that protects the next potential victim, the next lonely person looking for companionship who might otherwise fall into this kind of trap. These defendants built their lives on blood money. They turned murder into a business model. They deserve the maximum penalty the law allows. The judge sentenced Tiffany Eldridge to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus 75 years on the conspiracy charges. Brian Bates received the same. Neither would ever be free again. But as Marshall left the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras, he felt no triumph. Only exhaustion. "Mr. Eldridge," a reporter called. "How does it feel to see justice served?" Marshall paused, considering his words carefully. "It doesn't bring anyone back. It doesn't undo the damage. But it's a start. And we're not done yet. Because the trials of Sarah Stokes, Elaine Stokes, Lou Bautista, and the others were still to come. The war wasn't over. This had been just one battle. And Marshall was prepared to fight for as long as it took. Chapter 7. The Architect Falls. Sarah Stokes' trial began on a cold morning in February, 11 months after Marshall had pretended to be unconscious on that endoscopy table. The courtroom was packed. Families of victims, journalists, legal observers. This was the big one, the trial everyone had been waiting for. Sarah was the architect, the mastermind. If they could prove her guilt beyond reasonable doubt, the entire network's foundation would crumble. She sat at the defense table looking every inch the respectable businesswoman. Tailored suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a professional bun. Her attorney, Ernest Gordon, was known as a miracle worker who'd gotten off multiple high-profile white-collar criminals. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Gordon began his opening statement. "The prosecution would have you believe my client is some kind of criminal mastermind. But the evidence will show that Sarah Stokes is a victim of circumstance, a woman whose name and reputation have been exploited by actual criminals to deflect from their own guilt." Melinda Turner's opening was devastating. Sarah Stokes didn't just participate in murder for hire. She invented the model. She recruited the women, trained them, connected them with corrupt medical professionals, and took a percentage of every death benefit collected. Over 15 years, her organization killed at least 15 men that we can prove, and possibly dozens more. She turned death into a business, and she's going to pay for it. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They brought in digital forensics experts who'd recovered emails from Sarah's encrypted servers, detailing recruitment strategies and target selection criteria. They showed spreadsheets tracking operations across multiple cities, with columns for mark value, timeline, and payout status. Roy Vaughn testified about his investigation, walking the jury through how he'd connected the dots between seemingly unrelated deaths across a decade. "The pattern became clear once you knew what to look for," Roy explained. Wealthy divorced or widowed men, whirlwind romances, quick marriages, sudden deaths within 3 to 6 months, and vanishing widows. It happened too many times to be coincidence. Lou Bautista took the stand, fulfilling her agreement to testify. She was serving her own sentence now, 25 to life, with possibility of parole, but she'd chosen cooperation over defiance. "Sarah recruited me at my lowest point," Lou testified. "I was broke, angry after a terrible divorce, desperate. She made it sound almost noble, said we were taking from men who had too much anyway. Men who were stupid enough to trust beautiful women they'd just met. She called it redistribution of wealth. How did the recruitment process work? Turner asked. She'd identify women in financial distress. Divorce records are public, so she'd scan those. Women who'd been married to wealthy men but got screwed in the settlement. She'd approach them, usually through seemingly innocent channels. A networking event, a support group, online forums. She'd befriend them, gain their trust, then gradually introduce the idea. Did she ever mention remorse? Concern for the victims? Lou's laugh was bitter. Never. To Sarah, they weren't people. They were targets, marks, sources of income. She used to say, if they're dumb enough to marry a woman they barely know and put her on their life insurance, they deserve what happens. The defense tried to discredit Lou, pointing out her criminal record and her deal with prosecutors. But her testimony was corroborated by too many other sources to dismiss. Elaine Stokes testified next, having been extradited from Dubai and secured her own cooperation agreement. My sister is brilliant, Elaine said flatly. Ruthless, sociopathic, but brilliant. She saw inefficiencies in how con artists typically worked, getting caught because they were greedy or sloppy. She designed a system that minimized risk and maximized profit. How? Turner asked. Compartmentalization. Each woman working independently, using false identities, operating in different cities. Waiting years between operations in the same geographic area. Using different methods for each death to avoid pattern recognition. Laundering money through multiple shell companies. It was sophisticated because Sarah made it sophisticated. And your role? I handled the financial infrastructure. Shell companies, offshore accounts, real estate investments to legitimize the money. I created the systems that made it all work. Elaine showed no emotion. Sarah had the vision. I built the machinery. Did you ever question the morality of what you were doing? No. Elaine looked directly at the jury. I should have. I know that now. But at the time, I'd convinced myself it was just business. That we were smarter than everyone else, and smart people deserve to win. I was wrong. The defense hammered Elaine on her cooperation deal, suggesting she was lying to save herself. But the physical evidence backed up every claim. Then came the surprise witness. Adrian Donahue, one of the network members who'd killed Jim Spencer, had been offered a deal similar to Lou's. She'd refused initially, standing by Sarah out of misplaced loyalty. But 6 months in jail had changed her perspective. I want to make this right, Adrian said, taking the stand. Or as right as it can be. I can't bring back the men I killed, but I can make sure Sarah pays for what she did. Her testimony was devastating. She described in detail how Sarah had recruited her, trained her to seduce and manipulate targets, taught her how to research marks and identify vulnerabilities. She had a whole manual, Adrian said. Like a playbook. The Lonely Widow's Handbook, she called it. It had scripts for different scenarios, advice on how to build trust quickly, how to isolate the target from friends and family. It was professional, terrifying, looking back on it. Did Sarah ever participate in the murders directly? Turner asked. Once. That I know of. Adrian took a deep breath. A man named Tony Costello, a surgeon who'd been helping with the operations. He wanted a bigger cut, threatened to expose everything if Sarah didn't pay. She invited him to dinner, poisoned his wine with digitalis, made it look like a heart attack. I helped her dispose of evidence afterward. The courtroom erupted. Even Ernest Gordon looked shaken. This was beyond what anyone had expected. Why didn't you come forward before? Turner asked. Because I was terrified. Sarah had dirt on all of us. She made sure of it. Pictures, recordings, financial records. She documented everything so she'd always have leverage. If anyone tried to leave or talk, she'd destroy them. Adrienne's voice broke. I thought I was trapped forever. But then the network fell apart, and I realized she was just a person. Evil, but human. She could be stopped. The defense called character witnesses who spoke about Sarah's charity work, her business acumen, her reputation in the community. But it rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Sarah herself chose to testify, against her attorney's advice. I'm guilty of many things, she said calmly. Poor judgment, greed, associating with criminals. But I never killed anyone. I never ordered anyone killed. The women in this network made their own choices. I provided opportunities, yes, but they're responsible for their own actions. Turner's cross-examination was surgical. Ms. Stokes, you claim you never ordered anyone killed. But isn't it true that you approved every target? I gave advice on which men would be easier marks. Yes or no, Miss Stokes? Did you approve targets? Yes. And didn't you receive payment from each successful operation? I was compensated for my consultation. 20% of every life insurance payout. Approximately $4 million over 15 years. You profited from murder, Miss Stokes. I profited from consultations. You profited from death. Turner pulled up an email. In this message to Lou Bautista, you wrote, Zachary Riley is approved. High-value target, low risk. Proceed with timeline delta. That's your code for a 6-month operation ending in death, isn't it? Sarah's composure cracked. That's not what that means. We have 12 similar emails, Miss Stokes. 12 times you approved targets who later died. 12 times you collected your 20%. Turner moved closer. You didn't pull the trigger or inject the poison. But you ordered it, facilitated it, profited from it. That makes you a murderer under Colorado law. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Guilty on all counts. 15 counts of first-degree murder. Conspiracy. Racketeering. The list went on. At sentencing, Marshall stood again to speak. But this time, he brought someone with him. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Marcus McKenzie. He's Chris McKenzie's son, Tiffany's first victim, the man whose death started this entire investigation. Marcus was 19, a college student studying engineering. He stepped up to the microphone with visible nervousness. I was 14 when my dad died, Marcus said quietly. They told me it was an accident, brake failure. I believed them. But I always wondered, my dad was so careful about car maintenance. It didn't make sense. His voice strengthened. When Mr. Eldridge's investigation uncovered the truth, it destroyed me all over again. Not just that my dad was murdered, but that I'd spent 5 years believing a lie. That's what Sarah Stokes stole from me. Not just my father, but the truth. Marshall put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Sarah Stokes built an empire on stolen lives and stolen futures. She deserves the maximum penalty for every single life she took. The judge sentenced Sarah Stokes to 15 consecutive life sentences, plus 450 years on the remaining charges. She would die in prison, no possibility of parole, no hope of ever being free. As they led her away, Sarah looked back at Marshall one last time. Her expression was cold, calculated. Even now, looking for an angle, a way to win. She found none. Chapter 8. Unfinished business. The trials continued over the next year. One by one, the network members were convicted. Adrian Donahue, Lou Bautista, Elaine Stokes, all received lengthy sentences. The doctors who'd facilitated the murders, including 2 they discovered after Sarah's records were fully analyzed, were stripped of their licenses and imprisoned. But Marshall couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. He sat in his home office late one night, going through the case files one more time. Roy had moved on to other investigations, though they still spoke regularly. Keith had returned to his regular legal practice. The families had gotten their closure, or as much as was possible. Yet Marshall felt hollow. You look like hell, Christina Roman said from the doorway. She'd become a regular visitor over the past year, their shared trauma forging an unexpected friendship. Can't sleep, Marshall admitted. Keep thinking about the ones we missed. The ones we missed? 43 possible cases, remember? We confirmed 15. That leaves 28 deaths that might have been murders, but we couldn't prove it. He gestured to the files. 28 families who'll never know the truth. Christina sat down across from him. Marshall, you can't save everyone. You brought down an entire murder network. You gave 9 families justice, exposed the truth, ensured these killers will never hurt anyone else. That's not nothing. It's not enough. Then what would be enough? Marshall didn't have an answer. He'd spent a year consumed by the investigation, the trials, the pursuit of justice. Now that it was over, he didn't know who he was anymore. Have you thought about what comes next? Christina asked gently. Your business, your life, you put everything on hold. The business basically runs itself now. My team stepped up while I was focused on this. Marshall ran a hand through his hair. As for my life, I don't know. I'm not the person I was before Tiffany. I don't trust the same way. Don't open up the same way. That's not surprising. You were betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. I keep thinking about what Lou said during testimony. That I was the perfect mark. That I was so desperate for love that I didn't see the obvious red flags. Marshall's voice was bitter. She was right. I was pathetic. You were human, Christina corrected firmly. You were a good man who wanted companionship and believed the best in someone. That's not pathetic. That's hopeful. Don't let them take that from you too. Too late. They already did. Christina stood, moved around the desk, and took both his hands. Marshall Eldridge, listen to me. You are one of the strongest people I've ever met. You survived a murder attempt, brought down a criminal empire, and gave justice to families who'd been suffering in silence for years. You're not a victim, you're a survivor. And more than that, you're a hero. I don't feel like a hero. Heroes rarely do. She squeezed his hands. But you are one. To me, to Marcus McKenzie, to every family you helped. Don't lose sight of that. 2 weeks later, Marshall received a call from Melinda Turner. We've got a situation, she said without preamble. A woman just came forward. Says her fiancé died 6 months ago, and she thinks it might have been connected to the network. Marshall's exhaustion evaporated. Tell me. Keith Davis, no relation to your attorney. 45, software engineer in Boulder. Engaged to a woman named Jasmine Hines. Died of what was ruled a drug overdose. But his fiancée says he never used drugs, and Jasmine disappeared immediately after his death with $200,000 in life insurance. Marshall's blood ran cold. Jasmine Hines. That name was in Sarah's files, one of the network members they'd never located. I'll be there in an hour, he said. The woman who came forward was named Rebecca DeLeon. She was Keith Davis's sister, and her story was achingly familiar. Keith met Jasmine on that dating app, Rebecca said. Second chance romance. They connected over shared interests, started dating, got engaged within 3 months. I thought it was fast, but Keith was so happy. Said Jasmine was his soulmate. When did you start to suspect something was wrong? Marshall asked gently. After he died. The way Jasmine acted. No grief, just logistics. She settled his affairs, collected the insurance, and vanished. When I tried to contact her, all her numbers were disconnected. Her social media disappeared. It was like she never existed. Rebecca's hands shook. I told the police it was suspicious, but they said the overdose was clear-cut. They said I was just grieving, looking for someone to blame. Marshall exchanged looks with Turner. This was exactly the pattern they'd documented. We never found Jasmine Hines, Turner admitted. She's been underground since the investigation started. But if she's connected to your brother's death, we can reopen the case. I want to help, Marshall said immediately. Whatever it takes. Over the next month, they dug into Keith Davis's death. Roy came out of semi-retirement to assist. They exhumed Keith's body, ran new toxicology screens, and discovered what the original autopsy had missed. The drugs in his system weren't recreational. They were prescription medications, a carefully calibrated cocktail designed to cause respiratory failure. This is the same MO we saw with the others, the medical examiner confirmed. Someone with medical knowledge administered this. It wasn't suicide or accidental overdose. It was murder. They tracked Jasmine Hines through financial records, property purchases, and eventually facial recognition software. She'd changed her name to Melinda Turner, ironically, the same name as the prosecutor, and was living in Portland, Oregon. When the police arrested her, she was already engaged to another wealthy man, another engineer, another lonely soul who thought he'd found his soulmate. They'd caught her just in time. Jasmine's trial was quick. With the precedent set by Sarah Stokes' case and overwhelming evidence from the previous investigations, her defense had little to work with. She was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But more importantly, they'd saved her new target, a man named Rodolfo Law, who'd been days away from adding Jasmine to his life insurance policy. You saved my life, Rodolfo said when he met Marshall after the trial. I would have been next. I know what it's like to almost be next, Marshall said quietly. I'm just glad we got there in time. The resolution with Jasmine Hines brought Marshall something he hadn't expected, closure. He'd helped Rebecca get justice for her brother. He'd stopped another murder before it happened. And he'd proven that the work they'd done over the past year had lasting impact, that the network truly was destroyed. But it was Christina who pushed him toward the final step. You need to move forward, she said over coffee one morning. Not forget, never forget, but move forward. Build a new life. I don't know how to do that, Marshall admitted. Yes, you do. You've done it before. Christina smiled. After your first divorce, you built a successful business. You created a good life. Do it again. Different this time, but good. Marshall considered this. What about you? How are you moving forward? I'm starting a nonprofit, Christina said. Supporting families of murder victims, helping them navigate the legal system, connecting them with resources. Jim would have liked that. He always believed in helping people. That's beautiful. And fitting. Marshall felt something stir inside him. The first hint of purpose he'd felt in months. Can I help? Donate, volunteer, whatever you need. I was hoping you'd ask. Christina pulled out a folder. I've been working with some of the other families. We're calling it the Spencer Foundation after Jim. But we need funding, expertise, connections. Someone who understands both the business side and the personal impact. Marshall took the folder, flipped through the proposal. It was comprehensive, thoughtful, exactly the kind of project that would make a real difference. I'm in, he said. However much you need, whatever support I can provide. Let's do this. For the first time in a year, Marshall felt something other than rage or exhaustion. He felt hope. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 18 months after the endoscopy that should have killed him, Marshall Eldridge stood at a podium addressing a room full of journalists, law enforcement officials, and victim advocates. The Spencer Foundation was launching its first major initiative, a national database tracking suspicious deaths following whirlwind romances and quick marriages. They'd partnered with insurance companies, medical examiners, and police departments across the country to identify patterns that might indicate organized fraud and murder schemes. We've learned that these crimes thrive in darkness, Marshall said, his voice steady and strong. They succeed because victims are isolated, because deaths in different jurisdictions aren't connected, because families are told they're paranoid when they suspect foul play. This database will shine light into that darkness. Christina stood beside him, along with Rebecca DeLeon, Marcus McKenzie, and representatives from a dozen other families. They'd turned their grief into action, their pain into purpose. The Spencer Foundation won't bring back the people we've lost, Christina added, but it can protect others from suffering the same fate. It can give families the resources and support they need to seek justice. And it can ensure that networks like the one Sarah Stokes built can never operate in the shadows again. The database went live that day. Within a week, they'd received 47 reports of potentially suspicious deaths. Within a month, law enforcement had opened investigations in 6 states based on patterns the database identified. They were making a difference. But perhaps the most significant change was personal. Marshall had sold the house where Tiffany had lived, unable to stand the memories. He'd bought a smaller place in the mountains, surrounded by pine trees and clear air. A place where he could think, heal, and rebuild. He'd also made peace with trust, or at least started the journey. On a warm evening in June, 2 years after his near-death experience, Marshall sat on his back deck with a group of people who'd become family. Keith Davis, his lawyer and friend. Roy Vaughn, who'd retired from investigation work, but still consulted on complex cases. Christina Roman, whose friendship had been one of the unexpected gifts from this nightmare. Rebecca DeLeon, Marcus McKenzie, and several other family members of victims. They'd gathered for a barbecue, a simple celebration of survival and connection. No talk of trials or evidence or justice, just friends sharing food and laughter. I have an announcement, Christina said, raising her glass. The Spencer Foundation just received a major grant from the Department of Justice. $3 million to expand our operations nationwide. Cheers and applause erupted. Marshall felt genuine joy for the first time in what seemed like forever. And I have news too, he said. The cybersecurity firm is launching a new division focused on digital forensics for law enforcement. We'll provide free services to departments investigating suspicious deaths and fraud cases. More cheers. Roy leaned over. You've turned this into something good. Not many people could do that. I had help, Marshall said, looking around at the faces of people who'd stood by him, fought beside him, and refused to let evil win. Later that night, after everyone had left, Marshall stood on his deck looking at the stars. His phone buzzed with a text from Keith Davis. Proud of you, brother. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and made it count. Marshall smiled. He wasn't the same man he'd been before Tiffany. He was harder in some ways, more cautious, slower to trust. But he was also stronger, more purposeful, more aware of both humanity's capacity for evil and its capacity for resilience. He thought about the 9 men who hadn't survived, the families who'd been shattered. He thought about Rodolfo Law and the countless others who'd been saved because the network had been exposed. He thought about Tiffany and Sarah and the others, rotting in prison cells, their empire of death permanently destroyed. Justice had been served. Lives had been saved. Good had triumphed, though not without cost. Marshall raised his glass to the stars, a silent toast to the fallen and to the survivors. "We did it," he whispered. "We won." And for the first time since that terrible day in the endoscopy suite, Marshall Eldridge truly believed it. 3 years later, Marshall stood in a Denver courthouse, but not as a defendant or a witness. As a guest, Marcus McKenzie was graduating from law school, had already accepted a position with the district attorney's office. He wanted to prosecute fraud and murder cases to help families like his own. "You inspired me," Marcus told Marshall after the ceremony. "Watching you fight, refusing to give up, demanding justice. It showed me what one person can do when they refuse to accept evil." Rebecca De Leon had become the Spencer Foundation's executive director, expanding their reach to all 50 states. They'd helped identify and prosecute 12 additional murder-for-profit schemes, saving countless lives. Christina Roman had been appointed to the state's Victim Advocacy Board, using her experience to reform how law enforcement handled suspicious death investigations. And Marshall had found something unexpected. Peace, not the absence of pain. He still carried scars from Tiffany's betrayal, still felt the weight of the men who hadn't survived. But he'd learned to carry that weight with purpose, to transform trauma into action. He'd also learned to love again, carefully and slowly. Her name was Kelly Knowles, a forensic accountant he'd met while consulting on a fraud case. She knew his story, understood his caution, and never pressured him to move faster than he was ready. "You're not broken," she told him on their third date. "You're careful. There's a difference." It had taken Marshall a year to fully believe that, but he was getting there. As he watched Marcus accept his diploma, surrounded by the family of survivors he'd built, Marshall thought about the envelope that had almost killed him. That envelope had contained lies, forgery, a blueprint for his murder. But in a twisted way, it had also contained truth, the truth about Tiffany, about the network, about the danger he'd been in. That truth had set him free. He died that day in the endoscopy suite, in a way. The naive, trusting man he'd been had died. But from those ashes, someone stronger had emerged. Someone who fought back, who demanded justice, who refused to let evil win. Marshall Eldridge had survived, and he'd made sure it counted. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.